Yo, what's up YouTube? So you just got your podcast camera and now you're wondering, what is the best way to set this camera up to even shoot a podcast? Well, you are in luck because today in this video, I'm gonna show you the best camera settings to record a video podcast with. Let's go. All right, so before we get started, I know what you're probably thinking. How am I gonna show you how to set up a camera? I'm not even sure what camera you have. You can have a Sony, you can have a Canon, you can have a Nikon. Don't worry, these tips can be applied through any camera system because these are all settings that each and every camera has. But if you are a Sony shooter, you are in luck because I am a Sony shooter and I'm actually gonna be using one of the best cameras I feel like for a video podcast. That is the Sony FX30. And hey, if you wanna know more about that camera and using it for a podcast, click this video up above in the card. I made a whole video on why I feel like the Sony FX30 is the best camera for video podcasting, but that's besides the point. So the first thing you want to do in setting up any camera for a video podcast is to make sure that your camera's temperature settings are set to the highest, allowed max temperature control. So on the Sony FX30 that I'm using here, if you go all the way down to the setup box and go to the power selection, you see that you can set the temperature to high. So why do we want to set the temperature to high? Pretty much, with video podcasts, you're going to have long form content in the form of 15, 20, 30, 40, an hour, 2 hours of video footage. And you don't want to have to worry about, your camera overheating. So you want to make sure that you have your camera temperature settings set to high, just to allow us to be able to handle longer record times. Now, like I said, I haven't used a Canon in a minute and I have definitely never used a Nikon, but I'm pretty sure that those cameras have some type of setting that has some type of temperature control that you can set to a higher level. If they don't, I'm sorry, this doesn't apply to you. Panasonic as well, but like I said, if you're using Sony, make sure you cut that temperature level on high. All right, so another thing that you're gonna wanna make sure you do as it pertains to the camera's temperature is if you have a flip out, fully articulating screen, you're gonna wanna make sure that you flip that screen out. This is the best way to film, to avoid any type of overheating. I'm not gonna say you're gonna avoid it, but you will definitely extend the period in which your camera can record, because with the screen closed, things tend to heat up a little bit faster than when the screen is flipped out. So make sure that you flip that screen out when you're gonna be recording those long form podcasts. All right, so on to the camera settings. So with any camera, you're gonna have your ISO, your aperture, and your shutter speed. And what you want those set to for your video podcast, it really all depends on you. So I'm gonna start with shutter speed first. With your shutter speed, that's always gonna kind of be the same. You're gonna wanna make sure you set your shutter speed 2 times your frame rate. So if you're filming your video podcast in 24 frames a second, you're gonna wanna be at 50 frames per second or 48 if your camera can do that. And if you are shooting at 30 frames per second, you're gonna wanna be at 60. And God forbid, if you're shooting at 60 frames a second, you're gonna wanna be at 120 or 1/25 of a second for your shutter speed. Now, ISO and aperture can really be tricky as it pertains to your video podcast. Now, like I said, it's all gonna depend on the person and it's definitely gonna depend on the camera. So again, if you are a Sony user, you are in luck because I'm a Sony user and I'm gonna tell you pretty much what I do. I'm gonna start with ISO first. So I like to shoot at the native ISO. Now, the video podcast that I shoot, and I'm gonna show you some clips of that in a minute, mainly when I'm talking about aperture, the video podcast that I shoot, there's not a whole lot of light in the venue, so I automatically have to go to my second base ISO, which is the 12,800. This really brightens things up, but because of my scene, there's a lot that I need to get in focus. I need to have a higher aperture because I need multiple things to be in focus. I got like 4 people. It's a real big set. So with my ISO jacked up to 12,800, it brightens everything up. And when I put that ISO kind of at like 8 or 9, because of the way my scene looks, it makes everything balance out as far as the image. Don't want to get too ahead of myself. Like I said, you have to take into consideration what your camera is. You don't have to be like a slave to your base ISOs, especially if you're not shooting in log. But if you really want to take advantage of your camera sensor, especially if you're using Sony, I really like to stay at either 640 or 12,800. But if you're not shooting in log, like I said, you can pretty much set your ISO to what you need it for your scene. All right, so as far as my aperture is concerned, I'm actually gonna take you into my computer so you can kind of see what I mean about the aperture is really determined upon your scene and what you need to be in focus. So let's turn around and go into my computer. All right, so as you can see, I'm in my computer. This is the podcast that I record. It's really more so like a TV talk show. It's called The Realish TV. And as you can see, there's a lot going on here. Let me full screen this real quick. As you see, we got 4 people, we got objects, we got lamps, we got chandeliers, we got this table. If I was to shoot this at a 2.8 aperture, say if I wanted to use my first ISO of 640, things will be dark because it's not like 12,800. I would have to then lower my aperture down to 2.8, but my camera would literally be hunting for faces. It would be trying to focus on one thing, and that real shallow depth of field would cause all of this whole image, well, the majority of it, to be blurry. That's why, like I said, I jack things up to 12,800, and like on the back of my camera, like when I'm shooting, it becomes real bright. And as I dial in that aperture to about 8 or 9, that's when things level out and everything is in focus. As you see, we got him, we got her, we got him, and we have her, we have lamps. Everything looks good, it's smooth. And like I said, I record this podcast at 30 frames a second. So my shutter speed is at 60. I do 12,800 for my ISO on this shot, and I do I believe an 8 or 9 aperture. Now let me go to one of these. I actually use 4 cameras, by the way. So let me go to one of these other clips with her right here. Now, this is actually footage from my FX30. This is footage from my FX3, but let's go back to the FX30. Now I'm actually shooting this scene right here, which is different from the other scene. It's not too much that has to be in focus. I'm shooting this at aperture 2.8. I believe I have, don't quote me on this, maybe my Sony 85 on this. It's at 2.8. I'm using the base ISO of the FX30 at 800 to get the cleanest image possible. So 800 ISO. Like I said, shutter speed is still at 30 and my aperture is at 2.8, and that's the image I got of her. On the other side, the other guy got the Sony a7 IV. I got the base ISO going on that, which is, I don't think I use 3200. I believe I use the 800 ISO on this as well. I got the Tamron 70 to 180 on here, also at 2.8. So, you know, slightly blurry background, not really, but I'm able to shoot at that base ISO of the a7 IV. And yeah, man, still got the shutter speed set at twice my frame rate. So the shutter speed is at 60. And that's what we have. So we got one camera there. Boom, we got this camera, 12,800, 8.9 aperture than this camera. Same as the other one on this side. 2.8 at the base ISO of my camera for the cleanest image possible. And the shutter speed is always twice my frame rate. All right, man, so those are my best camera settings to shoot a video podcast. And remember, set your camera to the high temperature level. You're gonna wanna make sure that you flip that screen out to allow the camera to record the longest it can record before it overheats. And as far as your ISO, aperture, and shutter speed are concerned, it's really gonna be up to your preference and the look you want for your video. With shutter speed though, in my opinion, it should always be set to twice your frame rate. So 50 frames a second for 24p footage, 60 frames a second for 30p footage. For your aperture, consider your background, consider your scene, your venue. If you have things that you want in focus, you're gonna want a higher f-stop, f8, f9, f11 maybe, but you're gonna have to balance that with your ISO. Consider your camera, whether or not it has a base ISO. You're gonna wanna stay closer to that base ISO as possible because you're gonna get the cleanest image. So make sure, you know, plan these things out, assess your scene, see what you needed to set your camera to, and I'm sure the podcast that you record is gonna be fire. All right, man, so that's pretty much where I'm gonna leave it at with this video. I really hope you guys enjoyed it and found some type of value in it. If you did, please make sure to smash that like button. I would really appreciate it. And if you were wondering what other equipment or what the best equipment was to shoot a podcast, check out this video here where I outline the best equipment to shoot a video podcast. And I'll catch you guys later on. Peace out.